Let me now quickly cut across to Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director, Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security, also former Deputy Assistant to the US President. Lisa Curtis, welcome. You worked with President Trump. You've interacted with Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his team between 2017 and 21. What's your reading of Prime Minister Narendra Modi saying there will be no compromise on the interests of farmers and dairy workers, and President Trump insisting on imposing first 25% and then an additional 25% tariff on India, the second time for buying Russian oil?
I think it's very surprising that President Trump is employing these hardball tactics with India, an important strategic partner of the United States. And it really was quite shocking that he is threatening the additional 25% tariffs for India importing Russian oil when a country like China is also importing Russian oil, but he has said nothing about these Chinese imports. So it's very surprising, and one has to ask, what is driving President Trump to repeatedly criticize India's economy,
So what is
make these
driving
attacks
him?
against India, when during his first term, he had really elevated the US-India relationship, and he had a very strong rapport with Prime Minister Modi. And I think it has something to do with the fact that he is angry that India has contradicted his version of events of how the India-Pakistan ceasefire came about in May. I think that this is something that, he's taken personally and he's unhappy about. And so this may be part of the reason that he is employing such harsh rhetoric against India at this time. Of course, he wants a trade deal. That's part of it as well. But there seems to be something else going on, and I believe it has something to do with the aftermath of the India-Pakistan conflict.
But should India have handled that differently, given him credit, even though India insists he had no role to play in bringing about that ceasefire? Pakistan sought that ceasefire because India has very politely and yet firmly exposed US hypocrisy, if I may, on, let's say, trade with Russia. US continues to buy uranium hexafluoride from Russia. US continues to bring in chemicals and fertilizers, but wants to put a stop to India. There are no sanctions on Russian oil. There's a price cap, and India is buying it under that price cap. So are these President Trump's bullying tactics in your view?
Well, I think India is so surprised by President Trump's action because during the Biden administration had really turned a blind eye to Indian purchases of Russian oil. So I think this is like whiplash for India. This is a completely different approach that President Trump is taking toward Indian purchases of Russian oil. But, the fact is, India did not import much Russian energy before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's simply taking advantage of the discounted prices. So, in my opinion, it would not be difficult for India to reduce its dependence on Russian oil, go back to some of its previous suppliers like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and others. And this would help I think, resolve the trade tensions. So this is one way that we could see the trade tensions die down. And we know that a U.S. trade negotiating team is going to India later this month. So there is time to cool the tensions down, to come to some kind of trade agreement that could resolve the situation. But it will require some kind of concession from India. And in my opinion, this concession could be India actually reducing its dependence on Russian oil imports.
Well, there are some indications that India is reducing oil from Russia. But overall, the current situation, in your view, Lisa Curtis, what does this mean for the India-US strategic partnership? Because President Trump is also to travel to India for the Quad Summit in November. So just about 3 months to go. Can the situation be resolved by then, in your view?
Like I said, I think it's possible that the two sides could still come to a great trade agreement, which would help smooth over some of this harsh rhetoric that has been coming out of President Trump over the last few weeks. That is possible. However, I think that President Trump is unnecessarily risking the larger India-US relationship. So much has been invested into building up the strategic partnership really over the last 2 decades by Republican, Democratic presidents alike. And I think that President Trump's tactics are risking that larger relationship. And India could turn to other partners. It could turn more to Russia. We're already seeing that India is improving relations with China. Of course, they had a major border crisis just 5 years ago, but we are seeing India try to improve relations with China. So, India is showing it has other options other than the United States. And I think it's problematic because the U.S. has done so much to try to build up this relationship and build up Indian trust and confidence in the United States. And so all of that is being, put to the test unnecessarily. I think President Trump did not need to employ such hardball tactics when trying to come to a trade agreement with India. And President Trump should be sensitive to India's terrorism concerns.
Indeed, indeed. But, on the issue of the negotiations that are currently on, apparently there are reports that seem to indicate that the U.S. wants greater access. The U.S. wants access to our agriculture and our dairy, and that's a red line for any government in India. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi, you just heard him, he said there will be no compromising the interests of our farmers, our dairy workers, and fisheries. You expect any forward movement in the 6th round of talks around the 25th of August?
Well, that is correct, that President Trump now seems to be demanding more access to India's agriculture sector, which also is surprising because what we were hearing a couple of weeks ago is that the U.S. negotiators understood India's red line when it comes to its agriculture sector. It employs almost 50% of the Indian population. It's very politically sensitive for Prime Minister Modi. And there seemed to be some recognition of that on the U.S. part a couple of weeks ago. Well, all that seems to have changed in the last few days. And why that change has taken place, it's unclear. Whether it's being directly driven by President Trump or maybe his closest economic advisors, I think these are all questions that people have. So I think we have to wait and see how the next round of trade negotiations goes, whether there are other concessions that India might be able to make to satisfy the Trump negotiating team. This is all up in the air.
Indeed. How do you see the National Security Advisor's visit to Russia right now? Ajit Doval is there. He's said that Russian president will be visiting to India soon. Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be visiting China. What does this mean for India-US relations, or are they at two completely different levels?
Well, I think it's quite troubling that we see India rapidly shifting toward a focus on Russia and, of course, China. We know that Russia's been pushing this idea of Russia, China, India trilateral cooperation, which to me does not benefit India. India had a major border crisis with China. India knows that China is a strategic rival and threatens its own borders. So the idea that somehow India would benefit from a trilateral partnership with Russia and China, I think is absurd and is not in India's interest. So I think we can say that India would be better off with a strong relationship with the United States, an investment in the Quad, which of course is supposed to a Quad summit supposed to take place in November. And this makes more sense for India strategically in the long term. But the U.S. has a role to play, and the U.S. is not properly playing that role. The U.S. needs to, move forward, take steps to improve the U.S.-India relationship, not criticize and berate India and focus narrowly on market access. The U.S. has broader interests in its relationship with India, and the Trump administration needs to recognize that and make its policies accordingly.
Sincerely hope those in the White House and at Pentagon and of course the State Department are listening to you. Lisa Curtis for joining me here on India Today. Many thanks.